So we developed the idea for the workshop with the aim to map the landscape of knowledge production on and around intra-EU mobility regimes, to discuss and develop promising analytical approaches, and to network with critical researchers in this field, which is you.
Intersecting inequalities between East and West, but I am realizing that the title doesn't really does justice to the geographical scope of our different presentations. So we are not looking just between East and West, or maybe in just very broad terms, but we also have perspectives from what would be the South, and also some perspective from East to East trans-semi-peripheral migrations. So I would like to welcome Aleksandra Lewicki, Simone Varriale, and then we have a group of a collective that is presenting, that is led by Julia Rone, which I know could not be here today for some urgent reasons, but I think other people are here to present, like Anna and Mariana, maybe. And then we have Milena Blahuta. So we are having 4 presentations, but maybe more than 4 presenters. So for the third one, Mariana and Anna, feel free to arrange it as you see fit. So we have between 12 and 15 minutes for each presenter, so that we could have at least half an hour for a general Q&A session and discussion. And again, if you would like to ask questions, please do it directly. We will collect questions after the presentations in the Q&A panel after the 4 presentations. If there's anything really urgent that you would need to share, you could do so in the chat window, where you could also pose questions if you're not able to directly ask them. So we would make sure to bring this up to the attention of the speakers. So we are looking at this panel on a very broad range of topics, like racialization, class and gender lines, coloniality, migrant imaginaries, politics of emigration, and trans-semi-peripheral mobility in the post-socialist world. All diverse topics, but I think a lot of intersecting points will emerge from here that I would be happy to discuss in the Q&A session. So I give the floor to Aleksandra now.
Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. I'm gonna share my screen with you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Thanks so much to the organizers for putting such a fascinating workshop program together. There are lots of people here whose work I much appreciate and who I haven't even had the chance to meet yet. So it's very exciting. I'm tuning in from Sussex, where I have spent the last 18 months. And this paper that I'm going to present to you is something that I've been writing over the course of the last half year. So there is a lot of data in this, and I'm only going to give you an idea of my thought process. So please bear with me and trust me that some of these things that I'm telling you are going to sound like bold statements, but there is data to support all of these claims, but I literally haven't got the time to go into all these details. In terms of brief introduction, I am a senior lecturer at the University of Sussex, and I've recently taken over as co-director of the infamous Sussex European Institute, which those of you who've been sort of moving around in European studies, I'm sure have heard about, and which I'm trying to turn into a slightly different direction of a sort of critical post-colonial feminist approach to thinking about Europe and its sort of dynamics of creating cores and peripheries. So watch this space. There's going to be a lot more of this type of conversation happening from us as well. The paper that I'm presenting to you today is part of a special issue that I'm co-editing with Professor Ivan Kalmar from the University of Toronto, which is called Race, Racialization and the European Union, well, the East of the European Union, actually. And this is roughly the 3rd version of this title. So in your program, you still have the 1st version of my title. At the moment, the title is East-West Inequalities in the Political Economy of Race in Europe. It may change again, but eventually we'll get there. So the starting point from which I'm coming at this paper is this sort of perception, something that I've picked up in the last few years, that pre and post-Brexit Britain is increasingly perceived to provide a sort of specific context to think about the positionality of people who moved from the east of Europe to Europe's west. And this specific positionality has been described in various ways, and there is the literature, scholars seem to be agreeing that there's something distinct to that pre and post-Brexit British moment, but they don't necessarily agree on how to make sense of this. So my colleagues John Fox et al. Or Alina Rzepnikowska have described the experiences of East-West movers as distinctly racialized. Then people like Adrian Favell, who thought back in 2008 that race had virtually nothing to add to our understanding of East-West mobilities, now argue that these communities are affected by the fact that racism has returned to Britain, as if it was gone for a while and now it's back. So they're now affected by the fact that Britain has crossed the race line. And yet others are suggesting that the concept of race should be preserved for the context of post-colonial histories, for global south, global north relations, and has thereby very little to add to our understanding of dynamics within Europe itself. And they suggest that we shouldn't be collapsing concepts like nationalism and racism, and therefore describe what is happening to this particular group of movers as migrantization. Alyosha Tudor is one of the people who sort of have written in this vein. So I've noticed that what these studies have in common is that they mainly draw on either on a discourse analysis of media or public discourse, or they conduct interviews with East-West movers themselves, so get an account of their own experiences and theorize what's happening to them from the experience of their everyday encounters and so on. And many of these studies, obviously not everybody was writing about this, but because of this sort of quite narrow data focus on media reporting, public discourse, or interviews about experience, a lot of this literature explicitly or implicitly focuses on racism as an interpersonal phenomenon, what happens when you go to the shop sort of thing, people aren't nice to you or they don't get your name right and so on. Which implies an understanding that racism is a form of prejudice or attitude that's become salient at a particular juncture in time, which is pre and post-Brexit Britain. Now, I come at this sort of topic, I revisit this question, what is it, how can we account for the form of discrimination that's occurring for people who moved from the east to the west of Europe? I'm coming at this from a slightly different literature. Oops, I just skipped this is the literature, which some people would simply describe as a literature that's looked into the histories of racism. Other people prefer to call it critical race theory, which recently has become more and more to be perceived as sort of theoretical ideological construct. So I think obviously, that's the literature that I'm coming from, but I do think that it isn't just a conceptual framework. It is literally the literature that's looked into the history of various different repertoires of racism and mapped this history. So we have something to learn from the history of racism. So the sort of key insights that this literature has produced are first, racism isn't something that can just happen to anyone. It isn't something that necessarily occurs when a German and a French person don't get on, but it is something that's historically constituted, has attached itself to specific subjects in the history of Europe, and obviously Europe's subsequent expansion, and it's constituted through its stickiness. But it's also motile, shape-shifting and ever-evolving. That means it doesn't always come in the same shape and form, ideas change and so on. So we need to constantly re-examine it. And that's something that I'm doing in this paper as well. So there's definitely a history of attaching ideas of otherness to what has been a construction since the 16th, 17th century. Eastern Europe thought of together as a sort of homogeneous space is something that we can definitely trace back a fair amount of time without necessarily claiming that need continuities. So I think we need to examine this more closely where continuities are and where we have discontinuities. Another sort of key analytical point coming from this literature is that ideas of race emerge within wider political economic projects, geopolitical projects such as colonialism, Third Reich. So when racism is something that becomes very salient, is being adopted, is being sort of used to justify, is being used to justify something bigger. Usually involves the extraction of resources, the employment of people for cheap labor conditions, and so on. And obviously part of this literature is also the claim that racism does shape daily interactions, but this is only one small aspect of it, because it mainly manifests itself structurally in hierarchies in the labor market, through a stratification of rights, and by restricting mobilities of those population groups racialized as other. So what results from this sort of conceptual framework and this literature are slightly different research questions than the ones that have been asked in this literature that I sketched before. So what I'm interested in is asking, how are categories of belonging made, deployed, and invoked? And do these invocations suggest that they've acquired a racial quality? How are these categories put to work in institutions and legal frameworks? So what work do they do in shaping positionalities in the labor market, social rights, and rights to mobility? And how do they, on this basis, then shape biographical trajectories, not only in the everyday, but also in terms of the sort of biography that someone can have who is born in this part of the world? And so this is sort of the conceptual framework that I'm coming from, and I've tried to apply that to a very sort of thorough empirical study. This is what this paper is. So the two case studies that I'm looking at are Britain and Germany. And the empirical research questions that I'm sort of pursuing in this paper are, how do policymakers and activists who mobilize against immigration invoke the category Eastern European? How do these invocations shape political frameworks? And how are people from the east of the EU, in this instance, I'm just looking at the EU, not the whole of what's been constructed as Eastern Europe, how are they positioned in both societies? And I tried to do that through a combination of 3 different data sets. So the first source is a sort of something quite unsystematic. It's a discourse analysis of politicians' public statements that I've just recorded from reading the media. So there are 2 papers that I read every day. It's The Guardian and Die Zeit in Germany. And whenever I came across the mentioning of Eastern Europeans, I sort of made a note and put that to the side. So that's the unsystematic part of the analysis. But it was the pandemic. I didn't get to travel. I did get to read the paper every day. So it's fairly systematic in terms of depicting what liberal mainstream papers sort of write and what discourses they represent. The second 2 data sets are a lot more systematic. So I'm currently working on a large scale project over the course of 4 years, together with colleagues in Norway and colleagues based elsewhere who are conducting research on what we call anti-immigration social movements in Europe. So there's this understanding that mobilization against immigration is currently very influential, is occurring in different contexts, but forms something that we call a social movement because it doesn't just limit itself to movements like Pegida or the far right, as it's very often being reduced to, but it's something that stretches into the mainstream. So in this project, we're interviewing grassroots organizations, activists, public intellectuals, but also representatives of mainstream political parties who in one way or another have expressed their opposition to immigration. And we're sort of talking to them about their transnational ties and the ways in which they relate to what's happening in other countries to sort of establish whether this is a transnational social movement. So the project itself is not concerned at all with the topic that I'm working on here, but I was very surprised to see that the first 10 interviews that we did in the UK, all of these respondents seem to in one way or another refer to refugees, obviously, which is one of the main concerns, but each of them in one way or another also spoke about Eastern Europeans, and that meant very different things to the different speakers, right? So that's then something that I wanted to look at into the German data as well, and that data set is still emerging. So Manès Weisskircher, who I noticed is also one of the co-authors of one of the other papers that's being presented here, is currently collecting our data for the German case study. And maybe this is a good time to also thank my colleague Madison Clark and Graham Young, who've been collecting the data on the British case study. And then the third data set is a systematic mapping of statistical evidence about the positionality of these communities in both Germany and Britain, where we literally looked into what do we know about where they are in the labor market, what do we know about their experiences at the border and so on, what statistical evidence is publicly available, and what does that tell us about these communities. Thanks to Charlie Buck, who did the work on this. So now this is going to be, you're going to find this very crude because I'm going to literally jump into my findings without explaining each of these different sections to you. But I will talk a little bit more about one of those three sections in this paper because I literally haven't got time to do all three of them. It's quite complex, but I want to show you how I'm sort of getting at these findings. But just to briefly summarize, by the way, now is perhaps a good time to check where I am doing on time, because I can go on about this forever. Polina,
I think you have around another 5 minutes.
Perfect. Okay, I'll cater to that. So very crudely summarized, I identify three discursive tropes in this data set, and they're matching institutional trajectories. The first one is something that Lisa already touched upon in her introduction to the workshop, is the blaming of Eastern Europeans for the spread of disease, which has occurred in various shapes and forms, operates very analogously in the UK and in Germany, which is the sense that in German public discourse, you know, the virus has been eating its way into German lands from the east, which is particularly notable in contrast to the fact that, you know, a lot of the sort of initial virus incidences were connected to travelers, very rich travelers, skiers from Austria, but the virus wasn't eating its way anywhere. In this context, it was then later on in the second wave eating its way into German lands from the east. And that obviously is quite similar to the way in which race and disease have been historically linked and continue to be linked in anti-Muslim racism, in racism against people of color, and so on. And in this particular case, I show how it masks racialized hierarchies in the labor market, because we can see both in Germany and Great Britain that people from the east of the EU tend to be disproportionately overrepresented in professions that have a high exposure to COVID-19, so our key workers, and they tend to be disproportionately overqualified to be working in these professions, and they're sort of taking a distinct position within the racialized hierarchies of the labor market, both in Germany as well as in the UK. And that sort of is something that sustains the precarization of labor, because some of these professions would not be able to be held by locals, basically. So the pay, for instance, in agricultural seasonal work is so low, or in meat processing plants or in social care, that nobody could sustain a life or a family who has to, you know, constantly live in Germany or the UK, pay taxes there, have a permanent accommodation and so on. That's why these jobs are being taken by people who live in mass accommodation, share a whole bedroom, and so on. So this is something that allows companies in Western European societies, which is obviously something that's supported by the state, to precarize labor further, even more at the expense of people who do this work then. The second discursive trope that I've identified is the sort of narrative of the straining of public services by Eastern Europeans, which is something that in Germany takes this form of poverty migration that Lisa also touched upon. In the British context, it's very much a sort of perception that you can't get a place at the local school anymore, you can't get a place at the doctors anymore, which frankly is something that I've experienced myself. It's not pleasant at all, but has not that much to do with immigration, because immigration never reached an extent that would justify the unavailability of public services across the country, but has a lot to do with the rolling back of the welfare state, the politics of austerity and the reduction of these services for everyone. But rather than directing the frustration at the government that's been cutting these services for the last 15 years, it's being sort of directed onto immigration in a specific way, and used to justify the reduction of the social rights, the stratification of the social rights of people who move from the east of the EU. And then the third trope is the one that I have sort of here on a slide that I'd like to illustrate a little bit more, just to show you how I arrive at these quite bold statements, right? So that's the criminalization of people from the east of the EU, or Eastern Europeans, as they're called, as tricksters and traffickers. So the quote that I put up here is from one of our interviewees. This is somebody who's involved in what I call the vigilante milieu here on the English coast, so just around the corner from where I am in Kent. There are these people who during the pandemic have taken it upon themselves to be patrolling the English beaches. So they sort of walk across the shore with their binoculars and try to spot dinghies that are attempting a crossing of the English Channel from France, from Calais, to then claim asylum in the UK. And these people are sort of either trying to publicize the fact that channel crossings are growing, which by the way is, you know, also connected to Brexit, because obviously Brexit has done, yeah, anyway, complex story to explain that. I'm happy to explain that in the questions. I'll never get ready if I explain that now.
Just 1 minute left, sorry, Alex.
Oh dear. Okay, maybe I'll go to my conclusions straight away then. But what you can see in this quote is that there's this sense that the people who are doing the trafficking in the channel, these are the Eastern Europeans. And these repertoires are then reflected in legislation such as the Nationality and Borders Bill, and lead to a heightened deportability. So the proportion of people from the east of the EU who have been deported in the last few years has risen disproportionately in comparison to other population groups. So on this basis, I argue that the category Eastern European operates analogously to other racist repertoires, but allocates a specific positionality to East-West movers in West European societies. This racialization is entangled with and reinforces other repertoires of racism, of course, and together these racisms contribute to the precarization of labor, the politics of austerity, and the fortification of borders, all three of which I consider to be an expression of state-based neoliberal authoritarianism, and thereby also a feature of the post-colonial welfare state. So this is nothing new. This is something that we've seen coming for a good while across the 20th century, and that's sort of culminating right now. And this project relies on the recreation, the constant recreation and reinvocation of core peripheral relations that render the east of Europe a reservoir of cheap labor. So it locks the east of Europe in this relation of dependency. They externalizes the costs of labor, in that when social rights are limited in the West, these costs are obviously then relocated to the countries that people have to return to claim benefits if they get unemployed and so on. And they ensure the disposability of this workforce through deportability and so on. And to go back to my very initial point, that means that this form of racism shapes experiences at the level of personal interactions, of course, but also distinctly channel biographies from CEE countries. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Alex. And yeah, thank you for bringing race in the equation. And I'm sure that will follow up. And the global pervasiveness of race as a structuring principle and a thought that constructs and governs East-West mobility. So that for sure will come up in the discussion, I think. And now we'll move to the second presentation, which is by Simone Varriale. Welcome, Simone. And it's on the precarious teachers and superstar engineers, coloniality and gendered precarization in the post-2008 Italian migration. The floor is yours.
Just a second. I was struggle a bit with that. Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity to present what is really, really a work in progress. Let me just get to the full screen, okay? So today I'm gonna talk about, in a very short way, so again, like Alex said, apologies for some parts of the argument will be very much crunched to the minimum, so please ask for clarifications if something isn't clear. So I'm gonna talk about coloniality and gendered precarization in post-2008 Italian migration. And this comes from a qualitative study of Italian migration to the UK after the economic crisis. And it was conducted essentially 1 year after the Brexit referendum. So this is now quite historically specific. And it was based on biographical interviews. As initially, this was actually a project about social class and how social class travels borders. However, gender inequalities and their link with processes of transnational class formation emerged as quite prominent during fieldwork and analysis. And I'm still trying to make sense of these trends in a way that is academically decent, I would say. So again, I'm very open to feedback on that. Okay, so first of all, the sort of literatures I'm positioning this in, there is first of all, a specific literature on Italian emigration after the crisis, which I think we can safely say is largely gender blind. So for example, gender has been framed as not relevant to understand migrants' motivations in some publications, and the impact of gender inequalities on post-migration lives has been essentially ignored when it comes to Italian immigration after the crisis. But when we look at major debates on intra-EU migration, and this was mentioned also by Polina at the start, so for example, debates about migrant skills, how to categorize skilled migrants, debates about liquid migrations or mobilities, actually they rarely address gender inequalities and how they intersect with other social structures. This was actually pointed out already a number of years ago by other scholars, such as Weisskircher and Eleanor Kaufman. And to be fair, some things perhaps have changed. So now we have, for example, much more research on women's care and reproductive labor and social reproduction strategies. There's been some research on the links between gender, precarious labor, and access to welfare, especially in the context of Brexit. However, I would argue that we still are at a stage where intra-EU migration studies tend to be quite gender blind. And the focus of today is essentially on how, on gender inequalities among what are sometimes called the graduate or high-skilled EU migrants. And I'm particularly interested on the impact of gender on classed biographies of migration. As a part of a broader debate about how we distinguish between higher skilled and lower skilled migrants, which again has been largely gender blind as far as I know. So in terms of the theoretical framing of this, I'm gonna be quite brief about this. I partly draw on feminist work on the gender and construction of knowledge and skills. So I'm gonna focus today on gendered social biographies before and after migration, particularly in relation to the areas of education and work, so biographies of education and work. But I'm also drawing on the colonial theory, which is probably the part of the theoretical framing that is going to be reduced a bit here. So the part of this debate that is relevant here is especially the growing work on gendered and racialized construction of European cores and peripheries, as Alex also mentioned. This is actually relevant also to Italians, not because Italians are racialized in the UK as undesirable migrants, that actually hasn't happened even after Brexit, but because Italians associate Britain with the idea of a more meritocratic or modern culture in a kind of a quite essentialist way. And there is also an expectation, and that this was particularly the case among my female participants, that the UK would also provide a kind of more modern or equal gender order or gender structure. So I'm particularly interested in the tensions between these gendered and racialized imaginaries and lived biographical experiences of migration. Quickly on the methodology, I just wanted to say this is based on a theoretical sample, which was initially designed to capture class inequalities before migration. So I paid particularly attention to education before migration, to get a good, a balanced sample in terms of class backgrounds. However, it was also a sample that slightly overrepresented women, so I would argue that is well positioned for an exploratory analysis of gender inequalities and their intersection with class trajectories. There are also other relevant axes of differences, which I'm not going to talk about today, but again, very happy to discuss various things later if there is time. So I'm going to focus on two case studies because I wanted to give you some sense of detail and richness in the biographical narratives, Adele and Mauro. And they essentially represent two ideal types because they represent broader gender trends within the sample. So what I found when I was looking at work and education in my sample, I found that women were especially concentrated in fields that are historically feminized, such as education, health, particularly nursing, foreign languages, social work, and the arts. Now, many in my sample are notably absent from these sectors, but some of them are also significantly connected to the automotive industry, as engineers, as project designers, as technicians. So essentially here today, I'm very much contrasting two highly gendered professional areas in the form of two biographies. So I'll start with Adele. So Adele moved to the UK for the second time in her early 40s, and it was in 2014. She had extensive previous experiences of international mobility. For example, she au paired in Germany and London when she was studying in Italy at the university. She worked as an Italian language teacher in the US later because she followed her male partner for 2 years to the US, where he was doing a master's in economics. They later relocated to the UK, where she became a postgraduate student and studied about foreign language teaching. And then they relocated to Italy from the UK. And she said this was because partly it was because she was following her now husband, because he relocated for a big work opportunity in Italy. He was an economic consultant, but also because at that time she was struggling to find employment that was in line with her qualifications in the UK. So what happens next? She spent 8 years in Italy working as a temporary or self-employed language teacher in Italian or English. During this time, she also divorced her former partner. And by this point, she had various graduate and postgraduate qualifications in English literature, applied linguistics, and foreign language teaching. So a highly skilled Italian citizen and migrants at different points, as we would say normally. This is how she described the reasons for the second migration. So she said essentially that she had tried many things professionally as a self-employed teacher, but I couldn't take it anymore because I kept working as a freelance Italian teacher. And after many years, it was all the same. I told myself, now I have a certain age, either I try to leave again before it's too late, or I adapt. And this will be my life until I'll be 70, 75. I'll be a self-employed freelance, essentially forever, she was saying. Initially, she tried to relocate to Germany because she essentially followed her previous connections. But in Germany, she only found 2 hours of Italian language teaching per week. So that was essentially another jump into precarity, as she put it. Later, she decided to relocate to England because essentially a lecturer in a university, a previous contact from her previous experiences as a student, helped her find some more hours of teaching. So this was still very precarious, but she decided to go. So what happens next is that Adele spends about 2 years combining hourly paid teaching, temp jobs that she found through the temp agency of the university, usually admin roles, and further training. Eventually, she landed a permanent position in university administration in a role that connected to international students. So she could partly use her previous extensive international experiences to get this job, but she also had to retrain significantly.
You have 5 minutes.
Okay, so so what happens to Adele in terms of imaginaries about British and North European modernity is that essentially employment insecurity very much transformed how she related to these imaginaries. She said at the start of the interview, I absolutely loved it, London. It looked like the land of opportunities. You must think that was a very different place 20 years ago. And she presented a narrative of decline. Now there were too many qualified EU migrants in her field. But England still offered the promise of a more modern culture and society and a more equal gender order in a sense. So she said, it's true there are problems here, but when you go home, you realize the way people speak, the things happening to women, the way people use language. Maybe it's all hypocrisy, but she said, I think this is still important, and it's something I always admired in Anglo-Saxon countries compared to us. I think we, Italy, still lag behind with this. So you can see how imaginaries of Anglo-Saxon modernity are still relevant, but no longer meaningful to discuss her experiences of work. So what is happening here, I would argue, is that we see the impact of transnational processes of precarization that are gendered because they affect a professional field that is largely occupied by women. And so we see how these impact the transnational devaluation of Adele's cultural capital. I've also mentioned her partner, who was an economist, and how his big work opportunities, but also educational opportunities, shaped quite significantly her previous choices of migration. Now I'm going to talk about Mauro in a very crunched way. But here, essentially, we have the opposite sort of process, a very quick transnational validation of a male-dominated form of cultural capital. And also a biography in which he benefited very significantly from the emotional and care war of his partner, who experienced processes of gendered precarization that are very similar to Adele's. So like Adele, Mauro moved to England in his early 40s. However, he stressed he had a good job for a good company in Italy. He was a CAD designer for 20 years. He had a secure contract. Interestingly, he wasn't a graduate. He started working as a skilled manual worker, but then essentially he took further training and became with time a CAD designer, also through what he presented as luck. So migration for Mauro had very little to do with experiences of employment insecurity. However, he felt underappreciated at work, both in terms of status and economically. He said, after 20 years of experience, you find yourself in your 40s and earning a little more than a factory worker. I mean, I'm a project designer, so I'm a bit higher up in terms of responsibility. He's also said his work was no longer well paid like it was in the 90s. And he's also mentioned a typical Italian, hence more kind of authoritarian style of management on the workplace as a reason for mobility. It's important to point out that he had a very strong fascination for the US, which he presented as a free country, and a strong fascination for English language. And he essentially decided to move to the UK because this was the closest option that didn't require a visa. He applied for entry position as an engineer from Italy, and he quite quickly found a position as an engineer, which essentially confirmed his narrative about the superior English mentality. So he said that he did this interview with his boss online. He was very nice. He said that his not very good English wasn't a problem. They were interested in his skills. And there I understood, he said, the mentality is completely different from Italy. So his narrative was full of these very strong metaphors of strong, essentialist, and in a sense racialized difference between North Europe and Southern Europe. Britain was the US, so there was a familiar geography here that emerges also from other studies of intra-EU mobility. His wife actually emerged as very central to the success of his migration in a number of ways. This is her biography, very quickly, as reported by him. I actually tried to interview her, but she declined. So she left a job as a preschool teacher to follow him. She had a degree in cultural heritage, but could not find any job in her area. So she retrained in Italy, and she worked as a preschool teacher for 3 years before they moved to England. Post-migration, her qualifications as a preschool teacher was not recognized. So at the time of my interview, she was working as a babysitter or nanny, as they put it, for a European family while she was starting retraining, which took a 2-year of a part-time course. She
you
was
need
also,
to wrap up. Sorry, you're out of time.
okay, that's fine. So I guess you see where I'm going with this. So my argument is that is this a gendered process of transnational class formation? And I'll very much leave it there to you as a question. I'll just point out that, of course, we have to talk about, if we talk about precarization here, we have to recognize this is a gendered but also significantly privileged form of precarization. So in the narratives like the ones of Adele, the main issue usually is to keep working in your job or your passion, rather than issues of strict economic necessity. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. And that's it. Let me just take away the slides.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you also for bringing into the conversation the important perspectives of feminist and decolonial scholarships for disentangling this core periphery connections that mark these mobilities. So now we have a collective of presenters. So Manès Weisskircher, Mariana Mendes, Julia Rone, and Anna Kyriazi. But I believe Anna and Mariana are here to present today the politics of immigration, a research agenda on the political impact and differentiated politicization of immigration in the EU. So Anna, Mariana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Polina. I will start and then Anna will take over. So this is a collective paper, but it's not a very, well, let me present myself first, sorry. So the way we all know each other here in this, these 4 people is that we did our PhDs together back in Florence at the European University Institute, and we took it from there. We are now in different places. I am in Dresden as postdoc researcher. Anna can introduce herself later. So our paper is basically a research agenda paper. So I'm not bringing you here any empirical original research. What we do is really a typical research agenda article, which is still a draft article, even though we have been thinking about it for quite a while. So we're all political scientists, and we come more from the mainstream political science field, and I guess you will see this throughout the presentation, so a bit of a different perspective here. And what we do in this research agenda article is basically make a plea for academia and political scientists in particular to look more into what we think is a fairly neglected topic of research in mainstream political science, and that's immigration within Europe. And we don't call it intra-EU mobility, we call it immigration with an E. In particular, the politics of immigration. So we started from basically looking, well, realizing that there is this enormous gap, and you all know this, between academic, but also public and political attention that is being paid to immigration with an I, and not so much to the flip side of the immigration coin, which is emigration. And of course, every immigrant is an immigrant from somewhere, and for every country of destination, there is a country of origin. So to an extent, this gap between the attention paid to immigration and immigration is understandable, given that immigration with an I is a much more politicized topic. However, we think that there's a bit of a blind spot there. And this can also be due to the fact that the issues of the periphery sometimes tend to remain also peripheral in mainstream academic research. And I think there are good reasons to look at immigration too, and the perspective of the descending countries in Europe. This imbalance, for example, is quite notorious in public opinion surveys. So there's a 2019 study that some of you might be familiar with, a survey by the European Council of Foreign Relations that took many people by surprise when showing that people in the East and also in the South of Europe, many people worry more about emigration, about the exiting of citizens, than about immigration, the entry of foreign citizens. So to address this imbalance, we kind of propose a research agenda, and just to be sure and clear here, we are not the first to do this. Actually, Cecilia Bruzelius, she published last year an excellent agenda article also on taking immigration seriously, but she focused on the need to study the impact of immigration on the welfare states of the sending countries and on social rights. And we do something else. We propose to focus on an equally neglected field of politics, and in particular, we focus on two avenues of research. The first is the political impact of immigration in sending countries. In particular, how immigration impacts the political participation of both those who leave as well as those who stay, both in its institutional and non-institutional forms. While existing research on the impact, the political impact, or the impact of immigration in general tends to focus more on the socioeconomic consequences, for instance, labor shortages or the impact of remittances back home. I think we know much less about the political impact, especially in the European context. And the second research avenue is focused on immigration as a political issue. That is, the ways in which immigration is framed and politicized by relevant actors in sending societies, and which policies have been adopted as a response, because there has been some specific immigration targeted policies in a couple of countries. And we think that variation in levels of politicization, or lack of politicization of immigration in contexts where it is a relevant social concern are also pertinent questions to pose. So I will just talk to you briefly about the first research avenue I mentioned, and Anna will talk about the second. So the first one has to do with the impact of immigration on political participation, as I said, and we start from the typical Hirschman framework of exit, voice, and loyalty, although we don't bring loyalty in the equation, to be fair. And we ask if exit decreases incentives to use voice back at home. So what is the impact of immigration on different forms of political participation of those who leave, but also and especially of those who stay? And there are many clues out there, but not that many empirical studies, actually. So Kelman, for example, writing about Hungary, he has pointed to immigration as a factor contributing to democratic decline, because he argues the exit of critical voices weakens opposition in Hungary. Also, Krastev has written quite a bit about this. He, together with Holmes, has said that immigration damages the chances of liberal parties in Eastern Europe, and that those who stay behind end up feeling like losers, the left behind, which might affect the ways they participate politically. There's also a recent study by Anneli and Peri focusing on Italian municipalities, and they show that in Italian municipalities, immigration levels are correlated with lower levels of political participation. And this is not only because those who leave were more likely to engage in politics, but also because those who stay might take immigration as another symptom of political inefficacy, or because remittances might decrease incentives to demand reforms. There have been studies in non-European contexts in Mexico, for instance, showing this kind of dynamic. Others also have highlighted, for example, I think a highly interesting case for the German-based people here is how the vote for the AfD in the east of Germany is strongly correlated, or an ecological correlation exists between voting for the AfD and population decline in Eastern Germany. In addition to these examples of voting or institutional forms of participation, we also think that the impact of immigration on non-institutional forms of participation is another relevant area of research. So immigrants themselves, they might have an impact on demobilization back home if one considers that the profile of many who leave correspond to the typical protester profile. There's a recent study that importantly indicates that it's not only exit, but even the awareness of the possibility of exit in itself can decrease an individual's incentives to participate in collective action. Nevertheless, we also have many counterexamples of ways in which exit and voice can nowadays be more easily combined in contexts where traveling is easier, where social media is there, and so external voices can also remain active in the politics of home countries. We also have examples of how immigration itself contributed to activism. So all in all, we think that this is, an interesting area of research, but we have mostly anecdotal evidence and few empirical studies on the European soil. So we think there is more room both for case study analysis, but also more systematic cross-country comparisons on this.
5 minutes left.
Okay, Anna.
Perfect. So I'm going to talk about the next area that we identify for potential research, where we have still more questions than answers, let's say, which is the politics and policies of immigration. So we look at the politicization, and when immigration is constructed as an issue of public policy concern worthy of intervention, but also when and why it becomes a part of a controversial public debate. And our starting point, as Mariana already mentioned, is that the politicization of immigration, so of incoming migrants, is still more relevant and more politicized, even in countries where immigration is actually a more relevant phenomenon, let's say sociologically. So we do think that this is partly due to the issue of immigration as such, but we also believe that there are political strategies behind this. So there could be actually deliberate kind of depoliticization strategies taken by governments who feel embarrassed by the fact that of massive immigration from the country, from EU institutions or officials. And so on and so forth. So the dynamics between politicization and depoliticization are an interesting issue to investigate. Moreover, immigration becomes a controversial issue, is politicized at some moments, in some places. And so this is also interesting to investigate. We know in Lithuania, for example, in the 2016 elections, immigration became a key issue in the electoral campaign and influence the electoral results. So as comparativists, of course, we are interested in when, why, how, and by whom this issue is picked up. How does it appear in political agendas? Maybe not as a standalone issue, but maybe linked with other issues such as social policy. How is it articulated, whether it comes together with Euroscepticism? Like many times freedom of movement does. So this takes us to the issue of framing and discourses. Who are the immigrants? How is the immigrant image constructed? Usually it is our hunch, based on some research that we did already, that these are the young people, the highly skilled people, people somehow constructed as valuable, while other forms of migration, lower skilled, for example, they are obscured or they are not part of the public discourse. And then just to finish up our ideas for this exciting new agenda, research agenda, then there are emigration policies. So this is a very interesting question of policy design as well. How can governments devise policies to incentivize return or to disincentivize the emigration of people from their countries? And here we see some initiatives in the South and in the East, usually taking the form of nudges, so tax incentives, kind of programs of reintegration to the labor market, these kind of policies. Again, very interesting to look at the targets of these policies and their results, even though this is difficult to measure. So just to conclude, why should we care about this? We think that there are good reasons to care, because already we are in a context where intra-European free movement is being politicized, and it has been politicized more on the receiving side. But if we see that there is now an emergence of a political conflict also on the sending side, this is a warning for European integration, for the legitimacy of the European project. And second, of course, these processes all link to adverse demography. They link to depopulation of areas. They also link to gender, quite frankly, with these kind of family policies, fertility, this emphasis on fertility. So they have all sorts of important political and social consequences. So to conclude, we believe that emigration is worthy to explore because it shapes the demos, it shapes it psychologically, and it shapes it physically. And we do believe that, that the political dynamics linked to it are interesting, linking to issues of democracy, legitimacy, and power. So thank you.
Thank you, Mariana and Anna, for bringing this very interesting research agenda and this comparative framework for thinking about issues around politicization of immigration and migrants' political participation, and for also sticking to the time. So now we continue with the final participant. It's Milena Blahuta, who would talk about East-East migrations, trans semi-periphery mobility in post-socialist EU. Milena?
Yes, hello everyone. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So hello everyone. My name is Milena Blahuta, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Warsaw at the Faculty of Sociology. And so today I will talk about my research, which is also very much ongoing. I've been dealing with this topic for the last year. So this is my PhD project, and so I will rather discuss the framework I'm building my research upon and some very first observation, proper results, since I have just finished the first set of interviews. Sorry. Yes, so my research concerns the mobility between Poland and selected post-socialist countries that are currently a part of European Union. And this is a bit of unusual migration, also within Polish migration studies. It's usually focused on the east-west migration, either from Poland to the west or from farther east to Poland. So this is kind of a movement crosswise, this dominant direction of human capital flows. But honestly, within the last years, we can observe a significant number of Polish citizens choosing such a migration trajectory. And so this is the object of my study. So why these countries? I would connect this post-socialist EU. What I consider to be important is, first of all, that the migrants choosing such mobility, they're not limited by legal regulations. I mean, there is no visa regime, or like they potentially, of course, theoretically, they could choose any other immigration country within European Union. But for some reasons, they don't. Another thing is that with the fall of communist regimes and the systemic transformation, these once socialist countries have become integrated parts of capitalist world economy, and especially now that they're part of European Union. Third thing, that at the same time, even though being a part of this capitalist world economy, there's still these economies are still underdeveloped in comparison to so-called Western Europe. So using the framework of world system theory, we could consider these countries as semi-peripheries of the world economy. And so they combine this central and peripheral features of capitalist production. And it's also reflected in contemporary migration processes in these countries. So even though the Central European economies are now becoming immigration subcenters of Europe, so attracting immigrants from farther peripheries of the system, still they're the peripheral position, and still the citizens of these countries, they take decision of emigration towards the core of the capitalist system, so the traditional Western immigration centers. And the last thing is that all these societies, they were exposed to the discourse of transformation, catching up, and Europeanization, first during the systemic transformation in the 90s, and then with the EU enlargement, that was considered to be a successful completion of the process of this transformation and this functional and symbolic reunification with Europe, where the East has always belonged. So there is this modernization discourse, but also it's positioning this new European Union as at the same time also like backward, right, like lagging behind the West. So of course there are flourishing debates over this ambiguous position of Central Eastern Europe, so-called Central Eastern Europe, in the post-colonial theory, and the researchers, they like point at the need of developing of more nuanced approach that would reflect this peculiarity of this region. So I believe I don't have very space to go into details, but also I'm sure that you're aware of the discussion. So I just would like to emphasize that this like applying this post-colonial lens, it's a bit complicated, and this region does not really fit into neither into being a global north nor global south. So I really like the term used by the Polish researcher Marta Grzechnik. She describes it as a missing second word. So there is this in-between position. So, but coming back to my research, this is this theoretical background I'm basing on, and I research on these migrants that kind of move crosswise, this dominant direction of human capital flows, like from peripheries to the core. So the countries I research on, so after this first set of interviews I've done so far, I've decided to focus on the 4 countries you can see here, which is Czech Republic, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. And the reason is the interviews I'm doing, they're in-depth and semi-structured interviews. So my interviewees, they were pointing on these countries as important places that mostly because they're important centers, they have become important centers of outsourced services for Western companies, like big corporations. So either outsourcing or offshoring, and for this reason, there are many job opportunities. So when they were looking for a job, like these places, they were the ones that they would consider as the places of they could emigrate to. All right, so then I also assume in my research that even if this migration is quite unusual, it should not be only analyzed as a result of the agency of the individuals, but also as a complex of, as an outcome of really like complex economic and political and cultural circumstances. So there also must be some structure of opportunities if people emigrate to these countries. And especially these are really not just isolated individuals with some specific skills, you know, really there are hundreds of people choosing such a mobility from Poland now at the moment. Yes, so in my research, of course, among other questions, I'm trying to understand this economic logic and features of this today market of the European semi-peripheries, both in sending and receiving countries that support this mobility, and also how would people describe the structure of choice while taking the decision on emigration. But also another thing that I'm really interested in is this framework of how the people would construct the image of their own selves and also their country of origin, country of immigration in this mobility, because it's something that they don't really have a pre-existing framework to relate to. Like they don't have this internalized image of Polish immigrant in Romania, let's say. So this is something like I'm very curious how would they maybe indicate some frame for these interpretations, but also how they would construct it themselves. Yeah, so that would be the background. So as I said, I've just finished the first set of interviews. So these were 12 in-depth interviews. And it's actually very interesting, but I can share with you just, you know, very first conclusions. So first to mark, all the people interviewed, they were young. So they were between 25 and 35 years old, 36, sorry. And they were all having a higher education, usually with humanities, but also the social sciences. That was mostly, but not all of them, but mostly, or either they had some experience with studying at university at least. Mostly they were working in language jobs, or at least they started with their first job was language job. So I mean, working with Polish, which was like the main condition. They would get this job, and maybe later they would switch to another jobs, but not necessarily. And also what was present there was this category of escape. So usually they would like to leave Poland, either for personal reasons or many different reasons, but there was this thing that they would like to escape Poland, and then the country they would go to was less relevant than just leaving their home country. So
you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So that was just the best option available for them, either Czech Republic, Romania, Bulgaria, and so also the way they describe it, I can show you, is that okay, here. This is a man who emigrated from Warsaw to Prague because of his sexual orientation. He and his partner, they just wanted to leave Poland and go to another country because of the political situation. They were not feeling comfortable in Poland anymore. So this is how he describes living in Czech Republic. It's something like a better Poland. If I was to imagine an improved Poland, it would be Czech Republic. It's pretty here, but not the level of, let's say, France or I don't know, Germany. People are nicer, but also not too much. And that's also appearing in these interviews, that people feel very comfortable. They feel at home, accepted. You know that this immigration was very easy, no stress at all. Also, they use words like this. But what I would like to talk a bit in this last 3 minutes I have would be this image of Polish emigrant that they have. So as I said, I'm interested how they would build their image in this migration, but also what appeared in these interviews that I didn't really expect is that they have this internalized image of Polish immigrant in the West. And you can see here. So they kind of build their identity kind of in relation to that image of Polish immigrant in the West. And that's more or less directly, it was something they would like to escape while taking the decision of immigration. This is an interview with a woman that worked, first they moved with her boyfriend to Bulgaria and then to Romania. So she noticed that both Romanians and Bulgarians, they respect Poles pretty much. And first she called this immigration an ennoblement, but then she said that maybe not. It's like being from Poland in this part of the world, you always feel confident you're someone. And then I don't know, if it seems to me that if I went to Germany or England, I would be only, you know, a Polak for physical labor. Here, however, I'm someone with extraordinary language skills. Thanks to this, I can do the job of specialist. So, and then I asked her like if she maybe has a personal experience in working in the West, and she didn't. It was just the idea that she had, that if she went there, she would be only a Polak for physical labor. Then another person who worked in Romania, she also claims that this is a completely different immigration that, for example, Berlin or something, and she bases this, also she was never there, but like, I mean, just traveling, but no migration experience, but they Googled, they were scrolling through Facebook groups for foreigners in Berlin, and reading these statements, they decided that no, because they were scared of the poor language level and the problems discussed in the forum. So, and the same woman continues. So people in the UK, in Germany, those immigrants, she has the impression they're very simple people. And this case was actually fascinating because she worked in a customer service in Romania that was actually outsourced from Germany to Romania, but it was a customer service of a hotline from mobile network that also had a Polish language version, but it was outsourced from Germany to Romania, and then they needed Polish workers to work in this hotline. So that was her impression after working this hotline, that the people, they were very simple and they're completely different category of immigrant than they are. And this is the last quotation. This is a man who works in Romania, also in Bucharest, and he describes how his mother visited him in Bucharest. So she was very nicely surprised with Romania. She didn't expect that this is what Bucharest looks like, that it's normal here, right? And then he had a very big problem with the describing what's the image of Romania. So he used actually the term gypsy national minority after long thinking, running barefoot on the streets, just dirt, crime, poverty. But then the mother came and she actually saw that it does not really differ from Warsaw. And that's interesting, even somewhere among her friends, she always says, oh, my son lives there in Romania. And she's so proud of the fact that it's Romania, it's not some UK or something like that. So actually, this migration, it's even a reason to be proud. And you can even find this a bit really racialized or like colonial discourse in a way, right? This othering of this country. So they are kind of, some of them also feel superior in relation to the country of immigration. Okay, so just to conclude, so as you can see, my research is still ongoing. So this is very preliminary conclusions, but I think it seems very promising. And so further questions I have, and I would love to discuss with you, is that, well, we have this structure of opportunity of semi-peripheral job markets that you could see both as a limitation, but also opportunity. So all these migrants that I talked to, they use this semi-peripherality as a chance for them to emigrate. So also my question is, are these migrants privileged or underprivileged? Because on one hand, their position in the country of immigration is relatively high. I mean, like they managed to use this semi-peripheral job market structure. to build their quite comfortable life abroad. So their salary is quite high comparing to the other people in the country of immigration. But also, on the other hand, the same structure is the effect of inequalities, right? So the new EU still being a source of cheap labor force for the Western companies. And the last question is like, because it seems like a lifestyle migration, but also, is it really, if people are leaving Poland because of homophobia or racism, they all mentioned that, or political situation? Also, last thing that was surprising for me, that all of them, they were claiming they would love to come back to Poland, but they will not until the government doesn't change. So I will finish now. Thank you.
Thank you, Milena. And yeah, for bringing these very interesting perspectives and mapping out these configurations of the peripheral Eastern migration regimes.
Much to all four of you. It's impressive. Hello, everyone from Regensburg. My name is Tanja Visic. Just quickly to introduce myself. I am working as a postdoctoral researcher at the Department for Sociology and Gender Studies at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Just started my postdoc. If you go to the web page, I do not exist because it's in progress. But I'm doing for my postdoc interesting project about academic mobilities in Europe and in Germany, called Logistical and Social Entanglements of Career Mobilities, Work-Life Balance, and Intersectional Inequalities in the Life Course of Academics in Germany. Previously, for my PhD, which I did at the Max Weber College in Erfurt in Germany as well, was about ethnographic study of gender labor mobility, focusing on the process of cross-border elder care mobility from ex-Yugoslavia countries to Germany. Thank you again for your inspiring papers, which reminded me on two things. I will be very brief and to leave enough time for others to intervene and to ask. Two things. It reminded me how it's important to question and to think about categories and terminologies such as migration, immigration, mobility, circular mobility, which are often tightly related to legal mechanisms of the regime of mobility control and citizenship legislation, as we have seen. However, the migrant, is not only shaped but through the legal mechanisms and through the state, but also through the practices and discourses of an array of other bodies and agents, from NGOs, media, trade unions, and academics at the end. So, loaded with a political connotation, these terms, I would say, do not allow enough for highlighting processual character of spatial labor or occupational mobilities, whatever you call them, as the ways socially, geographically, and politically contextualized immobility and mobility play out in the reproduction of intersectional inequalities, and as Milena showed now, construction of biographies, aspirations, and motivations for migration, mobility, or immigration. Secondly, certain perspectives on labor mobility and migration, from my point of view, can be frustratingly simplified. And we need to really be careful about when we are reducing the world of human movement to undimensional place, where countries are categorized as EU versus non-EU, or East, or just West, especially if we consider Europe's fluid borders and its peripheries, heterogeneity of citizenship statuses, and multi-faces changing dynamics in different geopolitical settings. That is for me. Thank you very much.
So would any one of the presenters like to engage with?
I want to engage with all of them. I want to engage Simone and to ask him about concepts of privileged precarities. That sounds great. I don't know if you found that somewhere, or you just invented that term. And yes, for Mariana, no. Yes, for Milena Blahuta, it's amazing that she is looking in the lifestyle migration and looking in a different kinds of mobility induced by different kinds of aspirations and decisions. Very important project, very good. And for Mariana, I lost it, but I will come back to some point.
Okay, so maybe Simone, if you would like to engage. with Tanya's
we
question?
perhaps collect a few, because I'm worried
Yes,
we're
yes,
not going to
yes,
hear
yes,
all
yes.
the questions.
Yes.
I will just
Okay,
say.
we can also.
Sorry. Go on.
Yeah, maybe we could also. Would you like to just quickly or?
So I was just gonna say thank you very much for the support, and also the idea of privileged precarity is not something I mean, it was really just, I didn't even use that specific term which you now used, which I think is really interesting.
No, you said it. You said it at some point, and it, you know,
Interesting.
it just stuck in my mind, and I was like, okay, this is great.
I'll still credit you, but it's a really good way of thinking about this, I think, because of course there is the lived experience is of precarity, but when you look at it in a broader perspective, you have to recognize that these are not precarities connected with economic necessities in strict sense, but about I have a passion, I have skills, this is part of me. I don't want to let give up. And I found that this particular problematic is very gendered, at least in my sample. So that is what I was trying to convey, really. But yeah, thank you very much for this idea.
Thank you, Simone. Let's collect a few more questions because we are really out of time. So it was Barbara, I think. Barbara Sameluk next.
Thank you very much. It was a really interesting presentation. So I'm currently at the University of Ljubljana, but I used to work in London for 12 years. So my PhD was on commodification of migrant labor from post-socialist Europe to the UK. And then I did a postdoc on work transitions and transnational mobility of teachers and social care workers from Slovenia. I found, Aleksandra, your paper really interesting because, for instance, in my PhD, I also discovered completely the same discourses, during the time of accession. In 2004, the same that the migrants from Central and Eastern Europe are bringing disease, that they are traffickers, that they are straining public services. But it was also very gendered in a way at that time, and it's translated then also into the market. Yes. So firstly, how transnational agencies utilize these discourses to market Central and Eastern Europe on the UK labor market, but then also the effect this had on women, for instance, who were for new arrivals who were coming to the UK. So there were cases of women, who were really surprised by this narrative, because they were often presented in these media discourses as being trafficked, by men and so on. So they were really seen as women who are willing to do, services. So they were very sexualized in a way. And they experienced this on the labor market by doing frontline jobs, or, by trying to find work through agencies, so they were get these propositions from their employers and stuff like that, So, and this is also then goes to the question of Simone, that you asked at the end, is there a gender construction of class? I think it's very intersectional in a way, because what I saw from my interview is that they really lost their social status, through racialized and gendered logic. So they were racialized in a way because they came from a specific periphery, and at the same time, women were racialized in a very specific way. And I think Linda McDowell writes really well about that, how we should think about how these different intersections are basically traveling with migrants, translating then in a very different way when they come to destination places. And then I also have in this regard, a question to Aleksandra. Do you plan to do also interviews with with people, with migrants, or in a sense to see the effects of these discourses that you are now researching?
Thank you, Barbara and Teresa.
Hi, so I'm Teresa Hendel. I have a dual affiliation at LMU and Augsburg, and I have a question for Alex. So I also work on concerns of racialization and intersectional theory of whiteness, which I think we need in this regard of capturing the structural inequalities that Eastern Europeans face in their everyday lives. And I was wondering, how do you deal with the tension, especially looking at it from critical race studies, that those of us who are white, and that's not all of us, this would be very different for a Roma migrant, for example. How do you navigate the situation where the ones of us who are white in sort of everyday, contacts, which is not, for example, with the immigration or institutions, we can sort of retrieve into the sea of whiteness, as Sarah would say. So this is something that I interrogate in my work, of the difference of what racialization means to Eastern Europeans and what it means to people of color, and how do you navigate it in your work? Because I think that we really carefully, and this is where I agree with Alicia Tudor, we need to be really careful about not minimizing that kind of racism that is faced by people of color who cannot whatsoever retrieve into a sea of whiteness in any sort of situation in their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Christoph?
Yes, thank you very much to all presenters for interesting discussions. I have a question for the author collective, Mariana and Anna. This is so fascinating and interesting what you presented. With a colleague from Bremen University, I just started a research project on similar questions at the University of Flensburg. So we are also looking at Romania, Lithuania, and Portugal, and what kind of discourses as well as policies come up in order to cushion the effects of emigration. My question to you is, whether in your account of or your try for a theory of emigration politics, that's how I understand your attempt, how you theorize actors within this framework, and whether you already have found a way in order to systematize actor interests and potential impact. So meaning, like, if you look at traditional or classical immigration politics, you have your set of actors, unions, employers, political parties that have a certain impact. Have you already done this or managed to do this with regards to emigration? Because I think this would be very helpful in order to theorize and systematize empirical work on the topic. Many thanks.
Thank you for the questions. I'm sure there are more, but I will just cut it here because we have just a few minutes for answers and discussion. So what I would like you to just take 1 minute, 2 minutes to reply. So let's start with Milena, if you want to engage with Tanya's comment and Tanya's question.
I don't think there was a question, just I could say thank you.
It was more like a support and
yes.
yeah, encouraged to look in it in a different kinds of mobilities and movement. Yeah.
Okay, so
I will not take time.
Okay, so then we move to Barbara's question. I think to Alex, she had 2 comments for you if you'd like to engage with these.
Thanks so much for all the fascinating questions. I'm going to keep it really quick, although I'd have lots to say, obviously. So first of all, to Tanya, these categories are absolutely artificial. And I think that a lot of people from what has been constructed as Eastern Europe now come together to think about forms of denigration, devalidation that they experience together, although they come from such different contexts. It's like I would have never thought of, having that much in common with somebody from, let's say, Bulgaria. And now we come together because we experience similar things in the EU. So I think these categories are artificial, but they have, like other racialized categories, empowering capacities as well, in that they provoke counter struggles. Thanks so much to Barbara. Please just send me a reference to your PhD. I'd love to read it. I completely agree that a lot of these courses, we can trace them back to the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, distinct racialization of Slavs in the 20th century, particularly National Socialism and so on. And some of these ideas travel through the terms of the EU enlargement. Yes, I would love to do more interviews. I've done some in the past, but so right now, I've got funding to talk to the people who construct these discourses, and obviously there's going to be future projects. Teresa, thank you so much for whiteness. I think that is their big challenge for thinking about race within Europe. I definitely don't take that challenge lightly, because I come from thinking about Islamophobia and histories of racism in which this repertoire is under-theorized. And so the only thing I would say to that is that I don't treat whiteness as a phenotype, but as a construction that largely involves the denial of privileges and so on. So I do think as people who are sort of widely perceived to be white, we do have to account for the privileges that we have. And I think we need to think of racisms as co-constitutive, mutually reinforcing one another and allocating specific positionalities to different subjects within these forms of hierarchies. So that's the way I handle this tension. But I perceive the tension, and I think we need to stay with the tension rather than ignore it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I would like to now give the floor to Anna and Mariana, if you would like to respond to Christoph's questions.
Yes, in 1 minute. Thank you for the smart question. It implies that you probably know more about it than we do. But my rather improvised answer to it would be that we do not see emigration, like the actor's position should not be taken as a kind of mirror image to immigration, but rather that there is a kind of upset of positions in very intriguing ways. So thinking of governments, for example, looking at them at the case that I know best, which is Hungary, but also a little bit Greece, that there you have this interesting situation where the political sociology of emigration is actually to the benefit of incumbents, while the politicization of the issue is not. So they may have incentives in keeping kind of people flowing because of remittances, because of the effects on kind of regime stability. At the same time, they do not have an interest in the issue becoming politicized because it is an embarrassment. So this would be one pattern. The trade unions, very interesting, because the trade unions have an interest in protecting their workers, even if they are abroad. But the problem is that with peripheral workers, sometimes the interest of the peripheral workers can seem aligned with the interests of employers. And so this creates interesting dynamics where the unions may want to argue that it's actually good for our workers to go abroad because economic rights and social rights are somehow aligned on the periphery, while they cannot be kept so tightly separated as they are, for example, in the core. So these would be some interesting kind of upsets in terms of the role and the interests of actors, but we are far away from having a theory of the politics of immigration. Thank you.
Mariana, would you like to add anything? We just have a few minutes.
No, Anna said it very well. We don't really have a theory of actors. Of course, when we speak about politicization, we are very much thinking of political actors, of government and opposition. But we actually think that it's also important to expand a little bit beyond that. So I would just suggest a very practical suggestion. I'm sure you thought about this in your research project, would be to look at who has an active voice in the public discourse, look in the media, who is speaking about immigration. I'm sure you will find, I mean, knowing the Portuguese case, political actors is definitely something important, but perhaps expanding beyond that to unions or even civil society activists would be really interesting.
Thank you. And finally, I would like to ask Simone if you would like to engage with Barbara's comment on the intersections between race and gender?
I'll just say very quickly that I think is a very important point, and it's very much the sort of lines along which I'm trying to think about, although as I said initially, this is very much still kind of work in progress. So I'll leave it there for now, if that's okay.